The promise of second chances. The autumn wind whispered through the towering skyscrapers of New York City, carrying the scent of damp concrete and distant car exhaust. It was an evening like any other in the financial district, where men in suits marched purposefully through the streets, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement, their eyes fixed on phone screens that dictated their lives. Among them was Henry Winston, a man who commanded attention without ever demanding it. At 52, he was the epitome of wealth and discipline, a self-made millionaire who built an empire of luxury real estate from the ground up. He believed in efficiency, in control, in the certainty that money could solve most problems. But money wasn't what brought him to a halt that evening. It was a boy, a small figure huddled near an alleyway, wrapped in nothing more than a thin, tattered blanket. His dark skin was barely visible in the dim glow of a nearby streetlight, but his eyes, large, round, and filled with something Henry couldn't quite name, reflected the golden light of the city like twin embers in the dark. Henry rarely noticed people like him. His world was one of high-rise condos and pristine penthouses, where problems like hunger and homelessness existed only in articles he skimmed while drinking imported coffee. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he stood there, staring across the street at the boy who had nothing. A voice in his head told him to keep walking. Instead, he took a step forward. A life of precision. The Louvre Grand, an exclusive five-star restaurant, sat at the corner of the boulevard, where the city's elite gathered for their overpriced meals. The maitre d' greeted Henry with a practiced smile as he stepped inside, brushing away the lingering cold from his tailored coat. "Mr. Winston, your table is ready," the man announced, bowing slightly. Henry nodded, barely acknowledging him, as he strode toward his usual seat, a private corner booth, white linen napkins, crystal stemware that glimmered under the ambient lighting. Everything here was predictable, controlled, but his mind was not. As the waiter approached, offering the usual pre-dinner aperitif, Henry turned his gaze back toward the window. The boy was still there, sitting against the cold brick wall, watching the world move without him. The waiter cleared his throat. "Your drink, sir." Henry hesitated before nodding. "Yes, the usual." His fingers tapped against the table as he tried to focus on the menu, but the words blurred together. His world, this polished, elegant world, suddenly felt hollow, like a stage performance he had memorized, but no longer cared to play. A fateful encounter. The evening passed in its usual rhythm. Courses arrived, glasses clinked, laughter echoed softly from nearby tables, and yet Henry barely tasted his meal. By the time the check arrived, he had made up his mind. He stepped outside, the crisp night air wrapping around him like a second skin. Across the street, the boy hadn't moved. Henry crossed the road before he could convince himself otherwise. The boy's head snapped up at the sound of approaching footsteps. His eyes, wide, watchful, took in the sight of Henry Winston, a man who looked like he belonged on a television screen, not standing before a homeless kid in a back alley. "What's your name?" Henry asked. The boy hesitated, his small fingers clutching the edge of the thin blanket around his shoulders. He was wary. Understandably so. Strangers didn't usually stop, and when they did, it wasn't to help. "Noah," the boy finally answered, his voice small but steady. Henry nodded, kneeling slightly to meet him at eye level. "How long have you been out here, Noah?" Noah shrugged, but the motion seemed too practiced, as if he had been asked this before but had long since stopped hoping for a solution. "A while." Henry exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This wasn't his problem. He had no reason to be here, and yet something inside him refused to walk away. "Have you eaten?" he asked. Noah hesitated before shaking his head. Henry stood. "Come with me." The boy flinched slightly, his body tensing. "Where?" Henry gestured toward the restaurant across the street. "Just for a meal." Noah's lips pressed into a thin line. "They don't let kids like me in there." Henry arched a brow. "They will if I say so." For a long moment, the boy just stared at him, as if searching for some sign that this was a trick. Finally, slowly, he stood, pulling his blanket tighter around himself like armor. "Okay," Noah said. They crossed the street together, drawing more than a few curious glances as Henry led the boy through the restaurant's grand entrance. An unlikely pair. The maitre d' nearly did a double take at the sight of Henry Winston, accompanied by a boy in ragged clothes. "Mr. Winston, should I?" "A table for two," Henry interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The man hesitated only a second before nodding. "Of course. Right this way." As they walked through the dining hall, whispers followed them like a tide. Wealthy patrons glanced sideways, eyebrows raised, champagne glasses paused midair. Henry ignored them. Noah sat stiffly across from him, looking out of place among the chandeliers and silk-draped tables. He didn't reach for the menu, didn't even touch the silverware. Henry noticed. "Order whatever you want." Noah bit his lip. "I don't know what half these words mean." Henry glanced down at the menu. He had memorized it months ago. "The chicken marsala is good." Noah nodded. "Okay." The waiter returned, taking their orders with a professionalism that barely concealed his curiosity. As he left, Noah sat in silence, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Henry studied him. He wasn't just dirty. He was careful, polite. The way he held himself, there was something practiced about it, like he was used to navigating a world that didn't want him there. "How old are you?" Henry asked. 7, Noah answered. Henry frowned. "Where are your parents?" Noah's fingers twitched slightly against the tablecloth. "It's just me." Henry didn't push further. When the food arrived, Noah hesitated for only a second before picking up his fork. He ate with restraint, as if afraid he would be told to stop at any moment. Henry sat back, watching him. The weight of this moment settled on him in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't know why he was doing this. He just knew he couldn't stop. The night was colder than usual, the kind of chill that crept into bones and made even the richest city streets feel lifeless. The financial district, a place of power and precision, carried on as it always did. Lights gleamed from towering skyscrapers, polished cars idled at red lights, and the world moved at a pace that left no room for hesitation. But inside the Louvre Grand, the world had slowed, if only for two people who had no business sharing a table. Henry Winston sat with his usual straight-backed posture, his expensive suit fitting perfectly against the leather seat. Across from him, Noah, a small, unnerved child wrapped in a threadbare hoodie, sat in stark contrast. His fingers gripped the silverware with an almost painful delicacy, his body rigid with the unspoken rule that people like him did not belong here. He ate carefully, deliberately, as if savoring every bite in case it would be his last. Henry watched, his mind strangely restless. Henry had spent his life in control. He dictated million-dollar deals with precision, decided the fate of properties before others even saw their value, and ensured that every aspect of his life was curated to perfection. And yet, in the past hour, he had acted on impulse, breaking the careful rhythm of his existence by inviting this boy, this stranger, into his world. And for the first time in years, Henry felt something he hadn't in a long time. Uncertainty. He cleared his throat, watching as Noah took another bite of the perfectly cooked chicken marsala, chewing slowly before setting his fork down. The boy had good manners. That was the first thing Henry had noticed. He didn't eat like someone who had never seen a proper meal before, nor did he shovel the food into his mouth like those desperate for their next bite. Instead, he handled his utensils with deliberate movements, the way a child who had once known stability might. That realization sat uncomfortably in Henry's chest. "How long have you been on your own?" Henry finally asked, his voice even but softer than usual. Noah hesitated, his fingers fidgeting against the linen tablecloth. "A while." Henry narrowed his eyes. "Define a while." The boy stared at his plate, as if debating whether to answer. Finally, with a quiet voice, he said, "Almost a year. A year." A child had been living on the streets for nearly a year, and the world had simply carried on. Henry's grip on his fork tightened. He was not a man who got emotional over strangers, but something about the way Noah said it, as if it were just another fact, made him pause. "What happened?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Noah shrugged, though it was clear the motion held weight. "Mom got sick. Real sick. She tried to hide it at first, said she was fine. But," his voice wavered, just a little, "she wasn't. She stopped painting. Stopped eating too. Then one day, she just wasn't there anymore." Henry inhaled slowly, the weight of those words pressing against him. He had met countless people in his life. CEOs, investors, politicians, but never had anyone explained loss so simply, so plainly. "And your father?" Henry asked carefully. Noah shook his head. "Never knew him." Silence settled between them, thick and unspoken. Henry wasn't sure what to say. He had never been good at handling emotions, let alone those belonging to a child who had clearly suffered far more than anyone his age should. But even as he searched for the right words, Noah straightened in his seat, pushing his plate away slightly. "I don't need pity," the boy said, his voice stronger now. "I can take care of myself." Henry blinked. The quiet dignity in Noah's words was more fitting for a man than a child. "This isn't about pity," Henry said finally. "It's about decency." Noah tilted his head slightly, as if studying Henry with the same curiosity that Henry had been using on him. "People like you don't stop for people like me." Henry had no answer to that, because he knew it was true. A decision that could not be undone. The night stretched on, and soon it was time to leave. As they exited the Louvre Grand, Henry's driver, James, was already waiting with the sleek black Mercedes, the door open, ready for Henry to step inside. Henry glanced down at Noah, who stood stiffly beside him, hands stuffed into the pocket of his hoodie, as if bracing against the wind. "Where do you sleep?" Henry asked, surprising even himself with the question. Noah glanced toward the alley across the street but said nothing. Henry exhaled. He had no business getting involved. He wasn't a man who took in strays or tried to save people, and yet something inside him refused to leave Noah here, in the cold, to disappear into the dark. Without another word, Henry gestured toward the car. "Get in." Noah hesitated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Why?" "Because it's cold," Henry said simply. The boy studied him for a long moment before finally moving, climbing into the back seat of the Mercedes with quiet reluctance. The door shut with a soft click. James glanced at Henry in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Where to, sir?" Henry hesitated. The rational part of him wanted to take the boy to a shelter, to hand him off to someone more qualified for this. But another part of him, the part that had led him across the street in the first place, refused. "My place," Henry said finally. James did not react, only nodding before steering the car into the night. The penthouse and the boy who didn't belong. Henry's penthouse was the kind of place people saw in magazines and whispered about at dinner parties. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, and every piece of furniture was curated for both elegance and comfort. It was a world away from the alley Noah had come from. When they stepped inside, the boy hesitated in the grand entrance, his fingers curling into the fabric of his hoodie. His wide eyes flickered over the marble floors, the towering bookshelves, the modern fireplace that flickered with soft warmth. "You live here?" Noah asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and wariness. Henry set his keys down on the glass table, shrugging off his coat. "Yes." Noah didn't move further inside. He stood awkwardly near the entrance, as if afraid to step too far in case someone decided he didn't belong. Henry sighed. "Come on. There's a guest room down the hall." Noah's gaze snapped toward him. "I can sleep on the couch." Henry frowned. "You don't need to. I don't mind." Something about the boy's tone, firm, insistent, made Henry pause. He wasn't used to being argued with, least of all by a child. But Noah's independence wasn't an act. It wasn't the stubbornness of a spoiled kid, but the survival instinct of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Henry exhaled and nodded. "Fine." Noah hesitated for only a second before walking toward the couch, pulling the thin blanket from his backpack and wrapping it around himself. Henry watched him for a long moment before finally turning off the lights. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Henry Winston, the man who had spent his life chasing wealth and perfection, found himself questioning everything. Because in all his years of success, he had never once wondered if something was missing. But now, with a small boy sleeping on his couch, a boy who had no reason to trust him, Henry felt something unfamiliar take root in his chest, and he had no idea what to do about it. The city was still asleep when Henry Winston woke up. The skyline outside his penthouse windows was painted in soft hues of blue and orange, the sun creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the towering glass buildings. Normally, he would have relished this moment. The early hours of the morning when the world was silent, his mind clear, and his time entirely his own. But this morning, something was different. He sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened. The apartment was unnaturally quiet, yet Henry could feel that he wasn't alone. For the first time in years, someone else was in his space. It was a foreign feeling, unsettling yet oddly grounding. He had always lived alone, built his life around solitude and order, and yet last night, he had invited a homeless child into his home without hesitation. Throwing the covers back, Henry got up and made his way toward the living room. He half expected to find the couch empty, the boy already gone, as if the entire thing had been some strange fever dream. But when he reached the doorway, he paused. Noah was still there, curled up on the oversized couch, his small body wrapped in the thin, worn-out blanket he had carried with him. He looked smaller in the dim morning light, his dark curls a tangled mess against the pillow. His chest rose and fell steadily, his face relaxed in sleep, and for the first time since Henry had met him, the boy looked at peace. Henry let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but seeing Noah there, in his home, brought an unexpected tightness to his chest. He was used to calculated risks, used to making decisions that had clear outcomes. But this was something he had not planned for. He turned away and walked to the kitchen, moving through his morning routine with precision. The coffee machine whirred softly as he prepared his usual black coffee, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He found himself glancing toward the living room every few minutes, as if expecting Noah to vanish. By the time the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, he heard the soft rustling of movement from the couch. A moment later, small, hesitant footsteps approached. Henry looked up to find Noah standing at the entrance to the kitchen, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The boy blinked at him. "You really didn't kick me out." Henry frowned, taking a sip of his coffee. "Did you think I would?" Noah shrugged, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. "Most people don't keep promises." Henry didn't have an immediate response to that. Instead, he gestured toward the bar stools by the kitchen counter. "Sit, you should eat something." Noah hesitated before climbing onto the stool, his movements cautious, like someone who had spent too much time expecting disappointment. Henry turned to the fridge, realizing too late that he wasn't entirely sure what to make for a child. His kitchen was stocked with the essentials, high-end ingredients delivered weekly, meals prepped by his personal chef when he was too busy to cook. But those meals were designed for efficiency, not comfort. He pulled out a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. "French toast?" he asked, glancing at Noah. The boy's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if surprised by the offer. "Yeah, sure." Henry wasn't sure why that response made him feel strangely satisfied, but he turned to the stove and got to work. It had been years since he had cooked for anyone other than himself, But muscle memory took over, and soon the scent of cinnamon and butter filled the air. Noah watched him closely, his eyes sharp, studying every movement. Henry wasn't used to being observed so intently. Most people in his life were too intimidated to watch him like that. "Do you always wake up this early?" Noah asked, resting his chin on his hand. "Yes." "Why?" "Habit." Noah hummed in response. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Henry paused, caught off guard by how easily the boy had read him. He flipped the French toast onto a plate and set it in front of Noah, avoiding the question. "Eat." Noah didn't argue. He picked up his fork and took a careful bite, chewing slowly before nodding in approval. "This is really good." Henry smirked slightly. "I'd hope so." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar. Henry had spent most of his life in solitude, valuing quiet moments as a necessity for productivity. But with Noah sitting across from him, eating breakfast in his penthouse as if it were normal, the silence felt different. After a few bites, Noah spoke again. "So what now?" Henry leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What do you mean?" Noah met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I mean, am I supposed to just leave? Or are you planning to keep me here forever?" Henry hadn't thought that far ahead. He had acted on impulse, bringing Noah in for the night, but the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He wasn't a social worker. He wasn't a father. He wasn't someone who took care of people. But he also couldn't just send the boy back onto the streets. "You're not going back out there," Henry said finally, his tone firm. Noah studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether or not to trust him. Then, with a slow nod, he went back to his food. Henry exhaled, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had just committed to, but there was no turning back now. A life interrupted. By mid-morning, Henry found himself in his office, staring at his laptop screen but seeing nothing. His mind was elsewhere, stuck on the boy currently sitting in his living room, flipping through the channels on the TV with quiet curiosity. Work had always been Henry's escape. It was the one thing that made sense, the one thing he could control. But now, for the first time in years, he was distracted. He barely heard the knock at his door before his assistant, Victoria Mears, stepped inside. She was sharp, efficient, and had worked for Henry long enough to know when something was wrong. "You're late," she said, arching an eyebrow. Henry glanced at the clock. It was past 10. He was never late. "Something came up," he muttered. Victoria studied him, her eyes narrowing. "That's not like you." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know." She set a stack of files on his desk and crossed her arms. "What's going on?" Henry hesitated. He had never been one to explain himself, but Victoria was one of the few people he trusted. He leaned back in his chair, debating how much to tell her. "I took in a kid," he said finally. Victoria blinked. "A what?" "A kid. A boy. I found him outside the restaurant last night." There was a beat of silence before she let out a dry chuckle. "You're joking." "I'm not." Her expression shifted, a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. Henry Winston, the man who doesn't even like working with interns, brought a child into his home. Henry sighed. "It's not a joke, Victoria." She sat down in the chair across from him, studying him with the kind of sharp gaze that made most men in the industry uncomfortable. "And what exactly is your plan here?" Henry exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window. "I don't know." Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's a first." Henry had no response to that, because, for the first time in his life, he truly didn't know what came next. Henry Winston had spent the last 30 years making calculated decisions. Every move in his career was measured, every investment carefully analyzed, every risk mitigated before it ever had the chance to become a problem. That was how he had built his empire, through logic, through structure, through absolute control over every aspect of his life. And yet, As he sat in his office staring at the untouched documents on his desk, he felt entirely unprepared for what was happening. A child. In his home. It had been a full 24 hours since Noah Carter had stepped into his penthouse, and already Henry felt the weight of the disruption. The morning had been spent ensuring that Noah had food, clothes, and a proper shower. Simple things, things that should not have been difficult. But as Henry had stood in the middle of a high-end department store, watching Noah awkwardly shift through racks of clothes that clearly didn't belong to him, it had become painfully obvious that this was more than just an act of charity. This was responsibility. And responsibility, at least the kind that had nothing to do with business, was something Henry had avoided for most of his adult life. Across the desk, Victoria Mears leaned back in her chair, arms crossed as she studied him. She had been his assistant for nearly a decade, long enough to know every one of his habits, his routines, his tendencies, and right now she was watching him the way a scientist might observe an experiment that had taken an unexpected turn. "You look exhausted," she said finally. Henry exhaled, rubbing his temples. "It's been a long day." She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "So, what's the end game here?" He frowned. "End game? With the kid?" Victoria gestured vaguely with her hand. "Are you planning to keep him?" Henry stiffened. "He's not a pet, Victoria." She arched an eyebrow. "That's not an answer." He glanced toward the window, his jaw tightening. "I don't know." It was the truth. He had no idea what the hell he was doing. He had never been good with kids. He didn't dislike them, necessarily, but he had always assumed that fatherhood was something other men pursued, men who had time for things like family and school plays and weekend soccer games. He had spent his life chasing success, and success had no patience for distractions. And yet, the image of Noah sitting at his kitchen counter that morning, eating French toast as if it were the first real meal he'd had in months, lingered in his mind. The way the boy had hesitated before taking a bite, as if waiting for the moment to be taken away from him. The way he had looked at Henry, not with gratitude, but with cautious disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into?" Victoria asked, breaking the silence. "No," Henry admitted. She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Well, at least you're honest." She tapped a manicured nail against the desk. "If you want my advice." "I don't." Victoria ignored him. "You need to figure out what you actually want out of this. If this is just a temporary arrangement, fine. But if you're even considering something more permanent, you need to start thinking ahead. Schools, guardianship, the legal side of things." Henry stared at her. "I brought the kid in last night. Let's not start planning his college applications just yet." She smirked. "I'm just saying, Henry, you don't do things halfway. If you're in, you're in." That was the problem, wasn't it? Henry Winston didn't do things halfway. He had spent his entire career pushing himself to be the best, to achieve more than anyone thought possible. He didn't take half measures, didn't leave things unfinished. And yet, here he was, standing at a crossroads with no clear direction. Victoria stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her blazer. "Think about it," she said as she turned toward the door, "because something tells me that kid's already thinking about it." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. And for the first time in years, he had no idea what his next move should be. The unspoken agreement. When Henry returned home that evening, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. He had expected Noah to be in the living room, watching TV or flipping through a book. Instead, he found the boy sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window, his knees pulled up to his chest, his gaze fixed on the city below. Henry hesitated before stepping closer. "Everything all right?" Noah didn't turn his head. "Your place is really high up." Henry glanced out the window. The penthouse had one of the best views in the city, stretching far beyond the skyline, where the streets below looked more like a distant painting than something real. "I like the height," Henry said simply. Noah nodded, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his hoodie. "It's quiet up here." Henry leaned against the wall, studying the boy. He had spent the past day trying to figure Noah out, trying to determine whether he was just another street kid looking for a way to survive, or something else entirely. "I don't know what to do with you," Henry admitted, his voice softer than usual. Noah finally turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do anything." Henry sighed. "That's not true, and you know it." The boy was quiet for a moment before shrugging. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not." But that didn't change the fact that Noah Carter had been sitting in an alleyway last night, alone and hungry, and Henry had seen him, had noticed him. And once you noticed something like that, you couldn't just turn away. Henry exhaled slowly. "I don't do things without a reason, Noah. And I didn't bring you here just so I could ignore you." The boy studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Then why did you bring me here?" That was the question, wasn't it? Henry ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling more exhausted than he had in years. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago," he said finally. Noah blinked. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to say something, but then he closed it again, his gaze dropping to his hands. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Noah said, "I don't expect you to keep me." Henry's jaw tightened. This isn't about expectations. Noah hesitated before asking the question that had been lingering in the air between them since last night. "How long can I stay?" Henry looked at the boy, the way his shoulders were tense, the way he was already bracing himself for disappointment. He didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing. For now, he wasn't going anywhere. Henry exhaled. "Let's just take it one day at a time." Noah nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the penthouse, his shoulders seemed to relax just slightly. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Henry Winston had always believed in structure. His life was a finely tuned system, a collection of well-planned days, calculated risks, and meticulous order. But ever since Noah Carter had stepped into his home, that structure had started to crack. It had been 5 days since the boy had come to stay with him, and Henry was no closer to finding a solution to the problem he hadn't meant to take on. Each morning, he told himself he would figure out a plan, call social services, speak with a lawyer, or find some practical way to resolve the situation. And yet, every morning, the thought of sending Noah away left a weight in his chest that he didn't fully understand. Instead, Henry found himself adjusting. He woke up earlier, made extra coffee, and now he cooked breakfast for 2 instead of 1. Noah never asked for it, but he always showed up at the kitchen counter, watching quietly as Henry prepared something simple: scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes pancakes when he wasn't rushing out for meetings. And then there were the other adjustments. The television, which had barely been turned on before, now played cartoons in the evening. The once pristine living room had traces of Noah's presence: an abandoned hoodie on the couch, a stray book left on the coffee table. The silence that Henry had once cherished was now replaced by the occasional sound of Noah's footsteps, the soft creak of a chair as he shifted his weight, the quiet hum of a kid who was slowly getting comfortable. Henry noticed all of it, and he didn't know what to do about it. That morning, as he stepped into the kitchen, he found Noah already sitting at the counter, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on the marble surface. His dark curls were still a mess from sleep, and his oversized sweatshirt nearly swallowed his small frame. "You're up early," Henry remarked, pulling a mug from the cabinet. Noah shrugged. "Didn't sleep much." Henry frowned slightly but didn't push. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, then hesitated before setting a second mug in front of Noah. The boy blinked at it in surprise. "It's just hot chocolate," Henry said, taking a sip of his own drink. Noah hesitated for a moment before wrapping his hands around the warm mug. He didn't say thank you, but the small smile that flickered across his face was enough. They sat in silence for a while. the only sounds coming from the city below. Finally, Noah spoke. "I saw the papers on your desk," he said, his voice cautious. "The ones about me." Henry stilled. He had expected this conversation eventually, but he wasn't prepared for it now. "I wasn't snooping," Noah added quickly. "I just saw my name." Henry exhaled, setting his coffee down. "I had my lawyer look into your situation." Noah didn't react at first. He just stared into his mug, his fingers tightening slightly around the ceramic. "And," Henry hesitated, "your mother didn't leave any legal guardianship papers behind. There's no official record of any relatives willing to take you in." Noah's expression didn't change, but Henry could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing hitched just slightly. "So, what happens now?" the boy asked quietly. Henry leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Legally, the state would place you in foster care." Noah swallowed, his grip on the mug tightening. "Oh." Henry studied him carefully. "That's not what I want for you." Noah looked up then, his brown eyes searching Henry's face for something. An answer, a promise, a sign that this wasn't just temporary. "What do you want?" Noah asked. Henry didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He had spent years making decisions based on logic and profit. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He didn't invest in things he couldn't control. And yet here he was, considering something that defied every rule he had built his life around. Finally, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, kid, but I'm not going to throw you into a system that won't look out for you." Noah nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in his eyes remained. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. Uncharted territory. By the time Henry left for work, he was already behind schedule. His assistant, Victoria Mears, was waiting for him at his office, her arms crossed as he stepped inside. "You're late," she said without preamble. "I know." She narrowed her eyes. "You never used to be late, Henry." He ignored her and set his briefcase down, rubbing his temples. Victoria sighed and sat across from him, tapping a pen against her clipboard. "All right, talk to me. What's the situation with the kid?" Henry exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I've been looking into his background. His mother didn't have any official documentation for guardianship, and there's no next of kin stepping forward." Victoria studied him carefully. "So, what are you going to do?" Henry hesitated before answering. "I don't know." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't not know things, Henry." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. "This isn't a business deal, Victoria. There's no strategy for this." She softened slightly at that. "You're right. There's not." She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "But I think you already know what you want to do." Henry looked away, staring out the window. Did he? A night of honesty. That evening, Henry returned home later than usual. Noah was sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels without much interest. He looked up when Henry walked in, studying him carefully. "You work too much," Noah said, setting the remote down. Henry smirked. "You sound like Victoria." Noah tilted his head. "Is she your boss?" Henry chuckled. "Not exactly. More like the person who keeps me from losing my mind." Noah seemed to think about that before nodding. "Sounds important." Henry sat down on the chair across from him, sighing. "Listen, Noah, about this whole situation." Noah's face remained unreadable, but Henry could see the tension in his hands. "I don't know what the right answer is here," Henry admitted. "I'm not a parent. I don't know how to do this. But I do know that I don't want you back on the streets." Noah studied him for a long time before finally asking, "What if I stay?" Henry hesitated. Noah's voice was quieter now. "Not forever. Just until we figure things out." Henry stared at him, this small boy who had somehow become part of his life without him even realizing it. He had spent years making decisions based on numbers and statistics, but this This wasn't something he could analyze. It was something he had to feel. Finally, Henry nodded. "Okay," he said. Noah's shoulders relaxed just slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he looked at ease. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was the first real step towards something that neither of them had expected. The following weeks passed in a way that Henry Winston had never experienced before. He had built his life around efficiency, ensuring that every hour of his day was structured, every task accounted for. But now, something had changed. Every morning, he woke up earlier than usual, not because of an important meeting or a business call, but because of the quiet sound of footsteps padding across his penthouse floor. Noah was an early riser, something Henry had learned quickly, though the boy never disturbed him. Instead, he would sit by the window, staring out at the world below, lost in thought. At first, Henry didn't ask questions. He wasn't sure he even wanted to know what went on in Noah's head. The boy had been through more in his short life than most adults, and Henry wasn't naive enough to think that a warm bed and a few home-cooked meals would erase years of hardship. But the more time passed, the more Henry found himself wanting to understand him. On the surface, Noah was quiet, observant. He didn't talk much unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were often short and to the point. But beneath that, Henry saw something else, an intelligence that had been sharpened by necessity, by survival. The way the boy carried himself, the way he watched people, calculated their actions before they even spoke, reminded Henry of someone who had spent years learning how to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. One evening, as they sat at the dining table eating takeout, because Henry had been too tired to cook, Noah suddenly asked, "Why do you work so much?" Henry looked up from his plate. "Because that's what I do." Noah frowned. "Yeah, but why?" Henry sighed, setting down his fork. "Because success doesn't happen on its own. I built everything I have from the ground up. If I stop, things fall apart." Noah tilted his head, considering that. "But you already have money, right? Like, a lot." Henry smirked. "Something like that." "Then why do you still have to work so much?" Henry didn't answer right away. It wasn't a question he often thought about. Work had always been a necessity, something he poured himself into because it was what he was good at. But lately, he found himself questioning it more and more. "I guess it's habit," he admitted. Noah stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "That's dumb." Henry let out a startled laugh. "Oh, is it?" Noah shrugged. "I mean, yeah. If you already won, why keep playing the game?" Henry leaned back in his chair, studying the boy in front of him. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that." Noah grinned. "I know." And just like that, something shifted between them. It was subtle, but it was there. An understanding. A different kind of battle. As the days passed, Henry noticed that Noah was beginning to settle in, though he never quite let his guard down completely. He still slept lightly, his body tensing at unexpected sounds, as if preparing himself to run at any moment. He never took anything for granted, never assumed that the food in the fridge or the clothes in his closet would be there tomorrow. But he was getting comfortable, and that terrified him. One evening, Henry found Noah sitting on the floor of his study, flipping through an old book he had pulled from the shelf. "You read?" Henry asked, stepping inside. Noah nodded. "Yeah, not a lot, but sometimes." He held up the book. "This one's weird, though." Henry glanced at the title, "The Art of War." He smirked. "That's because it wasn't written for kids." Noah raised an eyebrow. "You have a lot of books that weren't written for kids." Henry chuckled, walking over to sit on the couch. "I guess that's true." Noah hesitated before closing the book and setting it aside. "Did you always know you wanted to do this?" He gestured vaguely around the room. "The whole business thing." Henry thought about that. "Not always. When I was younger, I wanted to be an artist." Noah's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" Henry smirked. surprised. A little. You don't seem like the artist type. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, well, life had other plans. Noah was quiet for a moment before saying, "My mom was an artist." Henry nodded. He already knew that, but he had never pushed Noah to talk about her. She used to say that art was the only thing that made sense. Noah continued, his voice softer now. That even when everything else was a mess, you could still make something beautiful out of it. Henry felt something tighten in his chest. She was right, he said quietly. Noah looked at him, and for the first time since he had come to stay, his expression was completely unguarded. Do you miss it? Henry hesitated before answering. Yeah. Noah studied him carefully. Then why don't you do it anymore? Henry exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Because sometimes, when you stop doing something for too long, it's hard to start again. Noah frowned. That's dumb too. Henry chuckled. You have a habit of calling me dumb. You know that. Noah grinned. Yeah. But even after their conversation ended, Henry couldn't stop thinking about it. Because maybe the kid was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to start again. A new beginning. The first time Henry pulled out an old sketchpad, he felt ridiculous. It had been years, decades, since he had even considered picking up a pencil, and the idea of trying now, at this stage in his life, felt foolish. But then he thought about Noah. He thought about the way the boy's eyes had lit up when he talked about his mother's art. He thought about the way Noah had looked at him, not with pity, not with doubt, but with the simple belief that Henry could. So he tried. It was awkward at first. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and his mind fought against the urge to overthink every stroke. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. His breathing slowed. His thoughts quieted. And for the first time in years, Henry Winston felt like himself. When Noah walked into the study later that evening, his eyes widened. You actually did it. Henry smirked. What, did you think I wouldn't? Noah grinned, walking over to examine the sketch. It's really good. Henry exhaled. It's a start. Noah nodded, then hesitated before asking, Can I try? Henry looked at him, surprised. You draw? Noah shrugged. Not really. But my mom used to say everyone should try. Henry handed him the pencil. Then try. Noah hesitated for only a second before sitting down beside him. And as they sketched together in silence, Henry realized something. This wasn't just about art. It wasn't just about picking up an old passion. It was about connection. And for the first time in his life, Henry Winston understood that some things, some people, were worth the risk, even if they changed everything.